Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. We all know that volcanic explosive eruptions release CO2 emissions, and as such, they act as sources of carbon to the atmosphere. Well, in this talk, I will challenge this idea by showing that volcanic explosive eruptions should be regarded as carbon negative events. Let's start with some basics. Soils contain organic carbon in varying amounts. The ultimate source of carbon is the capture of atmospheric CO2 by plants. This carbon eventually ends up in soils in the form of dead organic matter inputs, and while most of organic matter added to the soil is mineralized and released back to the atmosphere as CO2, a fraction remains in the soils, and this carbon can persist for 10, hundreds, or even thousands of years. Therefore, soils accumulate carbon over time, and volcanic soils in particular, soils that form from tephra deposits, have an outstanding capacity to amass organic carbon. When a volcano erupts explosively, it injects CO2 into the atmosphere, and it also produces tephra fall that can cover soils and bury them. Depending on the thickness of the tephra deposit, this process may isolate the soil from the atmosphere and trap soil carbon at depths. This soil carbon is now locked away and is stable. So the question we ask is, what is the carbon budget of an explosive eruption? In other words, what is the mass of carbon dioxide that is emitted by an eruption, and what is the mass of carbon that is trapped in tephra-buried soils? So, in order to answer this question, we carried out a field study at Atacazo-Ninahuilca volcano in Ecuador. The last explosive eruption of Atacazo took place about 2,700 years ago. It is a so-called N6 eruption. In the field, there is thick soil that form on a tephra deposit from an older eruption of Atacazo about 4,400 years ago. And this soil is covered by the tephra fallout from the N6 eruption. We can calculate the mass of magmatic CO2 released explosively based on the volume of magma erupted and the fraction of the magmatic CO2 content which is degassed explosively. The volume of magma is inferred from the spatial distribution of the tephra deposits. At Atacazo, we sampled 35 soil profiles in the area affected by the N6 tephra, and we calculated a carbon stock for each site. We then derived a simple regression model that relates the carbon stock to altitude. This model was then used to estimate the total mass of carbon in the soil buried by the N6 tephra within an area of 930 square kilometers. The results of these calculations indicate that the amount of soil carbon buried by the N6 eruption of Atacazo more than 2,000 years ago is between 5 and 90 times the mass of magmatic carbon released explosively by this event. Therefore, the N6 eruption is regarded as a negative carbon event. We then wanted to generalize this finding and estimate the soil organic carbon stored by tephra deposits over a period of time in a volcanically active region. So we first calculated the magma volumes associated with explosive eruptions of different magnitudes. This allowed us to estimate the amounts of magmatic CO2 emissions as described earlier. For explosive eruption varying in magnitude, we estimated the surface area of the soils covered by tephra with a given thickness. The thickness of the tephra deposit is important because it dictates whether or not pre-existing soils are buried and isolated from the surface. The second problem was to infer for a particular location the duration of soil development, which controls carbon accumulation in the soils between two tephra deposition events. And so we needed to consider the possibility that tephra deposits from two volcanoes erupting at different times can overlap. We focused on eruptions with a volcanic explosive index of 4, 5, and 6, and we applied a probabilistic approach to our calculations. Finally, we compiled data on the rate of carbon accumulation in volcanic soils of different ages and from various climatic regions of the world. This allowed us to fit a model of carbon accumulation as a function of age. This dataset shows that carbon accumulation in volcanic soils is extremely fast in the first 1,000 years of soil development. Okay, so now we were ready to apply our modeling framework to the eruptive history of the Ecuadorian Andes during the Holocene, allowing us to estimate the long-term carbon budget by comparing the soil organic carbon stock with the magmatic CO2 emitted by the explosive eruptions. The next plots summarize the main results of our modeling work. The total magmatic emissions are represented in this graph by the black line with the median and two percentiles, 10 and 90. The total soil carbon stock is shown for different thicknesses of the tephra deposits, so 10, 30, and 50 centimeters, and for different isomass probabilities. This graph strongly suggests that Holocene explosive eruption in Ecuador have stored significantly more carbon in soils than what they released as magmatic CO2. So this is a new result. This is a key result, I believe, which suggests that volcanic explosive eruptions lead to carbon storage and should be regarded as carbon negative events, and we probably need to look at other regions in the world in order to assess the global significance of these mechanisms. Thank you very much.